Well, hello. Today we will be finishing Bloody Times, the funeral for Abraham Lincoln, and the manhunt for Jefferson Davis. Recall that we are now in chapter 3, and Union soldiers arrived to Richmond and were able to capture the city without firing a shot. And Jefferson Davis and his Confederate soldiers had left Richmond for Danville. And that's where we pick up the story. Chapter 3. The gloom that filled President Davis's train eased with the morning sun. Some of the officials of the Confederate government began to talk and tell jokes, trying to brighten the mood. Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State, talked about food and told stories. His hope and good humor were inexhaustible, one official recalled. With a playful air, he discussed the fine points of a sandwich, analyzed his daily diet given the food shortages that plagued the South, and, as an example of doing much with little, showed off his coat and pants, both made from an old shawl, which had kept him warm through 3 winters. Colonel Frank Lubbock, a former governor of Texas, entertained his fellow travelers with wild Western tales. But back in Richmond, the people had endured a night of terror. The ruins and the smoke presented a terrible sight. A Confederate Army officer wrote about what he saw at a depot, or a warehouse, where food supplies were stored. He said, "By daylight on the 3rd, he noted, a mob of men, women, and children, to number of several thousands, had gathered at the corner of 14th and Carey Streets. For it must be remembered that in 1865, Richmond was a half-starved city, and the Confederate government had that morning removed its guards and abandoned the removal of its provisions. The depot doors were forced open in a demoniacal struggle for the countless barrels of hams, bacon, whiskey, flour, sugar, coffee, the rest, raged about the buildings among the hungry mob. The gutters ran with whiskey, and it was lapped up as it flowed down the streets, while all fought for a share of the plunder." A Union officer wrote about what he saw as he entered the city in the morning when it was still burning. As we neared the city, the flames seemed to increase in number and size, and at intervals, loud explosions were heard. On entering the square, we found Capitol Square, the very important square, covered with people who had fled there to escape the fire and were utterly worn out with fatigue and fright. Details were once made to scour the city and press into service every able-bodied man, white or black, to make them assist in extinguishing the flames. Constance Cary ventured outside to see her ruined and fallen city. Horrified, she discovered that Yankees had occupied the Confederate White House. She stated, "I looked over at the president's house and saw the porch crowded with Union soldiers and politicians, the street in front filled with curious, gaping Negroes. The sight of ex-slaves roving freely about disgusted her. It is no longer our Richmond," she complained, and added that the Confederate anthem still had the power to raise some of the people's spirits. "One of the girls tells me she finds great comfort in singing Dixie with her head buried in her feather pillow." All day on April 3rd, Washington, D.C. celebrated the fall of Richmond. The Washington Star, the newspaper, captured the joyous mood. As we write, Washington City is in such a blaze of excitement and enthusiasm as we never before witnessed here. The thunder of cannon, the ringing of bells, the eruption of flags from every window and housetop, the shouts of enthusiastic gatherings in the street, all echo the glorious report, "Richmond is ours." The Union Capitol celebrated with President Lincoln, who was still with the Army, while Washington rejoiced. The Secretary of War, that would be Edwin Stanton, worried about Lincoln's safety. He believed that the president was traveling in enemy territory without sufficient protection. Stanton urged Lincoln to return to Washington, but Lincoln didn't take the warning. He actually sent a telegraph back that stated, "Honorable Secretary of War in Washington, D.C., yours received. Thanks for your caution. but I've already been to Petersburg, stayed with General Grant an hour and a half, and returned here. It is certain now that Richmond is in our hands, and I think I will go there tomorrow. I will take care of myself. Abraham Lincoln. President Davis did not arrive to Danville until 4 p.m. on the afternoon of April 3rd. It had taken 18 hours to travel 140 miles. The plodding journey from Richmond to Danville made clear an uncomfortable truth. If Jefferson Davis hoped to avoid capture, continue the war, and save the Confederacy, he would have to move a lot faster than this. Still, the trip had served its purpose. It had saved, for at least another day, the Confederate States of America. On the afternoon and evening of Monday, April 3rd, the government on wheels unpacked and set up shop in Danville, Virginia. Jefferson Davis hoped to remain there as long as possible. In Danville, he could send and receive communications so that he could issue orders and control movements of his armies. It would be hard for his commanders to telegraph the president or send riders with the latest news if he stayed on the move and they had to chase him from town to town. In Danville, he had the bare minimum he needed to continue the war. The citizens of Danville had received word that their president was coming, and a large number of people waited at the station for his train. They cheered Jefferson Davis when he stepped down from the railroad car. The important people of the town opened their homes to the president and his government. But soon, refugees fleeing from Richmond and elsewhere flooded into Danville. There was not enough room for everyone. Many slept in railroad cars and cooked their meals in the open. But in Danville, Davis and his government had little to do except wait for news. The future course of the war in Virginia depended upon Robert E. Lee and what was left of his army. Davis expected news from Lee on April 4th. But none came. The president longed for action. He wanted to rally armies, send them strategic places, and continue fighting. Instead, he had to sit still and wait for word from the Army of the Northern Virginia. April 4th and the succeeding 4 days passed. Noted Stephen Mallory, the Secretary of the Navy, without bringing word of Lee or Breckinridge or of the operations of the Army, and the anxiety of the president and his followers was intense. Refugees from Richmond carried wild stories. Some said Lee had won a glorious victory. Others said Lee was too busy fighting to send messengers. Jefferson Davis ignored the rumors. On April 4th, as Davis waited impatiently for news, Lincoln experienced one of the most thrilling days of his life. "Thank God that I have lived to see this," he wrote. "It seems to me that I have been dreaming a horrid dream for 4 years, and now the nightmare is gone. I want to go to Richmond." Admiral Porter, a Union Navy admiral, agreed to take him there. If there is any of it left, there is black smoke over the city. On the River Queen, that's a ship, they traveled up the river toward Richmond. When the water became too shallow for the big boats, Porter transferred the president and Tad to his personal craft, an admiral's barge. Despite the fancy name, it was no more than a big rowboat, but it allowed them to continue. The city looked eerie. Lincoln and Porter peered at the rebel capital, but saw no one. They saw smoke from the fires. The only sound was the creaking of the oars. The street along the riverfront was deserted, Porter observed, as if there had been a city of the dead. Although the Union Army had controlled the city for several hours, not a soldier was to be seen. The oarsmen rowed from the wharf, and Lincoln stepped out of the boat. Admiral Porter described what happened next. There was a small house on this landing, and behind it were some 12 Negroes digging with spades. The leader of them was an old man about 60 years of age. He raised himself upright. Position was as we landed. He put his hands up to his eyes. Then he dropped the spade and sprang forward. The man knelt at Lincoln's feet, praising him, calling him the Messiah, come to free his children from slavery. "Glory, hallelujah," he cried, and kissed the president's feet. The others did the same. Lincoln was embarrassed. He did not want to enter Richmond like a king. He spoke to the throng of former slaves. Do not kneel at me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank him for the liberty you hereafter enjoy. But allowing Lincoln to leave and proceed on foot to Richmond, the freed slaves bursted into joyous song. Oh, all ye people, clap your hands, and with triumphant voices sing. No force the mighty power withstands of God, the universal King. The hymn drew hundreds of blacks on the landing. They surrounded Lincoln, making it impossible for him to move. Admiral Porter recognized how foolish he had been to bring the President of the United States ashore without enough soldiers to protect him. The crowd went wild. Some rushed forward, laid their hands upon the President, and collapsed in joy. Some, too, awed to approach Father Abraham, kept their distance and speechless just stared at him. Others yelled for joy and performed somersaults. Lincoln spoke to them. My poor friends, you are free, free as air. You can cast off the name of slave and trample upon it. Liberty is your birthright, but you must try to deserve this priceless boon. Let the world see that you merit it and are able to maintain it by your good works. Don't let your joy carry you into excess. Learn the laws and obey them. There, now, let me pass on. I have but little time to spare. I want to see the Capitol. Porter ordered 6 Marines to march ahead of the President and 6 behind him, and the landing party walked toward downtown Richmond. The streets were dusty, and smoke from the fires still hung in the air. Lincoln could smell Richmond burning. By now, thousands of people, blacks and whites, crowded the street. A beautiful girl, about 17 years old, carrying a bouquet of roses, stepped into the street and advanced toward the President. Admiral Porter watched her struggle through the crowd. She had a hard time in reaching him, he remembered. I reached out to help her within the circle of the sailors' bayonets, where, although nearly stifled with dust, she gracefully presented her bouquet to the President and made a neat little speech while he held her hand. There was a card on the bouquet with the simple words that stated, "From Eva to the liberator of the slaves." Porter spotted a sole soldier on horseback and called out to him, "Go to the general and tell him to send military escort here to guard the President and get him through this crowd." "Is that old Abe?" the trooper asked before galloping off. Lincoln went on to the Confederate White House and entered Jefferson Davis' study. One of the men with him remembered watching Lincoln sit down and say, "This must have been President Davis's chair." Lincoln crossed his legs and looked far off with serious, dreamy expression. Lincoln knew the Confederate president had been there, in that room, no more than 36 hours ago. This was the closest Abraham Lincoln ever came to Jefferson Davis. One observer remembered that Lincoln laid back in the chair like a tired man whose nerves had carried him beyond his strength. Sitting in quiet study of the Confederate president, perhaps Lincoln weighed the cost. More than 620,000 American lives paid to get there. He did not speak. Then he requested a glass of water. After Lincoln left the Confederate White House, he toured Richmond in a buggy. Blacks flocked him and rejoiced, just as they had done at the river landing. But not all Richmond welcomed him at the ruined Capitol. Most whites stayed in their homes behind locked doors and closed shutters, with some glaring at the unwelcome conqueror through their windows. It was a miracle that no one poked a rifle or a pistol through the open window and opened fire on the despised Yankee president. Lincoln knew the risk. "I walked alone on the street, and anyone could have shot me from the second-story window," he said. His Richmond tour was one of Lincoln's triumphs. It was the most important day of his presidency. It was also one of the most dangerous days of his life. No American president before or since has ever placed his life in that much risk. Before Lincoln left Richmond, the Union general in charge of the city asked Lincoln to tell him how he should deal with the conquered rebels. Lincoln's answer became an American legend. He replied that he didn't want to give any orders, but "If I were in your place, I'd let them up easy. Let them up easy." During his time in Richmond, Lincoln did not order arrest of any rebel leaders who stayed in the city, did not order their property seized, and said nothing of vengeance or punishment. Nor did he order a manhunt for Jefferson Davis and the officials who had left the city less than 2 days ago. It was a moment of remarkable greatness and generosity. It was, in fact, Abraham Lincoln at his best. The end.